One direction that I've found to be very fruitful is to think about money in terms of not just, resources and things like that, but the capacity to create order in the world, to implement choices. So, for example, if I had a bunch of money given to me as a founder of a startup, for example, I could take that and I could invest it into building materials and make a new factory. So in a space where there was essentially disorder, that now I have essentially created order. I've created a building and a whole process by which a particular kind of thing can occur. So in this sense, there's a notion of thinking about monetary systems in terms of how they store and also enable choice. So you think about, a dollar as being the capacity to purchase a good or a service, but it's really to choose which good and which service, when that would be deployed and how that would work. So in one sense, we can think about money in terms of a choice process, in terms of a kind of representation or proxy for a choice process. People that have money have more choices in a certain sense. Whereas another dynamic which I've found useful in terms of thinking about money is to think about energy. Nate Hagen's brought this one to my attention. And he basically was noticing that in pretty much every epoch, we can sort of talk about how energy can be not just a token of something that is exchanged, like we could treat, a given amount of oil as having a certain amount of worth, but really the monetary system's defined in terms of the energy rather than the energy, in a sense, paid for by a monetary system. So in other words, if there's an equivalence between being able to get something done, being able to make a change in the world, that at some point or another, that change is going to involve energy. That choice is going to manifest. The potentiality is going to become actuality. That is an energy transition. So in this sense, moving our thinking from monetary systems to energy systems or to choice dynamics has actually been very liberating in terms of how to think about this sort of process. A third lens, which I have found to be extremely helpful in terms of thinking about monetary systems, is to think about game theory. So in any sense, any market system is a little bit like a game. In fact, it's a lot like a game. You're going to have winners and losers. You're going to have people who are more skillful in terms of how they manage it and how they don't. And over time, you're going to see essentially these forces that emerge as a result of the game process itself. So in a certain sense, you could treat the stock market, or you could treat the global economy as a little bit like a game, much the same way that you might think of, some slot machine in Vegas as being a game. So, you can invest, but it's speculative and you don't necessarily know in advance what's going to happen. I mean, you can influence the behavior of the market to some extent, particularly if you're, in the market as a manufacturer or as a, producer of some sort or another. But there's a sense in which the game dynamics and the way we think of market process as a kind of play between actors is again, it's a clarifying concept. So I find that between these three notions, thinking about monetary process in terms of what choices it is and what choices that facilitates or doesn't, and how those choices essentially manifest, thinking about it in terms of energy dynamics and energy flows, and then finally thinking about it in terms of game dynamics and game flows. And this isn't to say that I have a preference that, we should think in terms of money fundamentally, but just that when I find myself needing to think about monetary process, I find that these three lenses, I'm going to want to use each of them in turn to just make sure that I've thought through the fundamental issues clearly. If we just think about it in terms of a habitual, notion of a store of value or things like that, then you tend to kind of get locked into thinking about it as a fiat currency or some sort of cryptocurrency, or, things like hard assets as gold or land and stuff like that. Whereas as more fundamentally, there's a sense in which we're wanting to really look at the dynamics of the process itself rather than its particular manifestation or particular implementation. Otherwise, we're not really getting at the heart of the matter as far as I can see.